Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Electrical Safety and Construction webinar hosted by SafeWork New South Wales. My name is Jeff Adams, a Senior Inspector with Construction Services Group, and I'll be your host for today's session. I'm joined by SafeWork and Fair Trading inspectors, who I'll introduce as we move into the Q&A segment. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting the webinar from the lands of the Barramagadigal clan of the Durag people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the First Nations people participating in this webinar. Just some housekeeping before we begin. Today's session will go for about 45 minutes. You'll notice that Slido is enabled on your screen. Please use this to send us any questions you may have as we go through the webinar. We'll endeavour to answer all your questions. However, due to time, we may not be able to cover them all. So we may contact you directly, and we'll also make the questions and answers available after the presentation, along with any resources we take you through today. So what we'll be covering in this session, we'll look at why electrical safety is so important and explore the new penalties, share some real incidents and case studies and resources that will help you comply. Then we'll move into the Q&A session for today. Electrical safety has been identified as a key harm and is why SafeWork is conducting this project. Our program of work will continue to help PCBUs through education, with compliance visits happening in the new year, and later in the session, we'll share some of those resources to help you with this. Whilst the data remains consistent over the past 10 years, alarmingly, we've lost 3 workers' lives in the last 2 years. Everyone should be able to go home at the end of the day, so making safety at work needs to be your priority. And you can see this from the data shown. We are taking a zero-tolerance approach to putting workers' safety at risk, and as a result of the continual incidents occurring, in October this year, we introduced additional penalties around disconnecting electrical equipment, not preventing it from being re-energised, failing to use an RCD, and not conducting a risk assessment or following the control measures relating to overhead or underground power lines. The penalties for these range up to $1,200 for individuals and $6,000 for corporations. Now let's have a look at your duties as a PCBU. So a PCBU is a person conducting a business or undertaking and is the legal term we use for a business. The WHS regulations detail your duties in Part 3.1 for managing risks and health to safety. These being duty to identify hazards, managing the risks to health and safety, using the hierarchy of controls, and maintaining and reviewing the control measures implemented. We then move into some control measures that you may be familiar with. However, it's important for us to remind you as to what needs to be considered. In the WHS regulations under Part 4.7, General Electrical Safety in the Workplace and Energised Electrical Work, it states that you need to assess the risk, disconnect unsafe electrical equipment, regularly inspect and test electrical equipment, not work on live or energised equipment, and there is an exception to this with working on energised equipment, and it's got strict restrictions around it as it's for the supply authorities, but in general, it's not permitted. You need to ensure equipment is de-energised before working on it and restrict access to it, keep records of testing, comply with Australian New Zealand Standard 3012, and use an RCD and keep away from both overhead and underground power lines. Now we'll look at recent incidents that inspectors have been called out to. There are many incidents published on our SafeWork website, but for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to share 3 different electrical incidents as examples of where things can go wrong and what should have been done differently. This one occurred in March of 2020, where a 24-year-old electrician suffered serious burns to his forearms, hands and face when he touched a live electrical circuit that caused an arc flash explosion. What should have been done differently is work needs to be de-energised, young or inexperienced workers need to be supervised, and using the appropriate PPE. Training and supervision is paramount, and all too often we see young workers being left unsupervised or not having the experience for the work they are doing. This is where accidents happen, and this incident is a testament to what could go wrong. Make sure you provide the adequate supervision needed and consult with workers to check that they have a good understanding of what is required. In the next incident, this one occurred in November of 2018, where a 36-year-old worker was installing steel reobars into a wall cavity. While attempting to position the reobar into the cavity, it extended past the edge of the scaffold and touched the high voltage power lines. To assist in preventing this, hoarding needs to be in place. You can use the Look Up and Live app to make sure that you're carrying out work safely when working with overhead power lines, and consult with the supply authority. Looking at the red circle on the screen, it indicates the power lines. You can see that there is hoarding and tiger tails in place on the lower power lines, but not for the higher ones. You must make sure nothing comes into an unsafe distance of overhead or underground power lines, and you must follow the control measures directed by the supply authority. Also use the Look Up and Live app for overhead power lines, and obtain plans from Before You Dig Australia, which is formerly Dial Before You Dig, for underground power lines when excavating. Lastly, in April 22 this year, a 35-year-old electrician was fatally injured when he handled energised wires whilst completing works on an electrical circuit beneath a house. To assist in preventing this, make sure you isolate the installation at the main switch, test to ensure the equipment is de-energised, and check for other hazards such as working alone. Before making contact with or commencing work on equipment, ensure that it is switched off and test every circuit and conductor to ensure it has been properly isolated. Lock the circuit to prevent it being inadvertently re-energised. Looking at some of the resources we have to assist you in meeting your compliance duties, we have a new electrical safety and construction inspection checklist on our website. This can be used on your device. It's interactive PDF, so you can type straight into it, you save it, send it on if needed. And we recommend you keep this as a favourite and use this whenever you plan to do any work. It's a comprehensive checklist, and some sections may not apply to different sites, but by using it, you can ensure that you are taking all the necessary steps to work safely. As working on or near energised electrical equipment is a high-risk work, you must do a safe work method statement. This will ensure everyone on the worksite is aware of what is occurring and needs to be done, and we have a SWIMS template available on our website also. We have a safety cast that provides updates on current and emerging issues within the building and construction industry, and further information can be found on our website regarding these, or you can find it by searching SafeWork New South Wales Safety Cast on your podcast app. We also have a Speak Up app available to download, and this is an effective tool to report WHS concerns that you may have to us. It's completely anonymous, allows you to upload pictures and tag your location to assist in notifying us of your concerns. You can find it by searching Speak Up on your App Store. Lastly, we also have available to eligible applicants the small business rebate of $1,000. This can be used to purchase safety equipment and items to improve your work health and safety for you and your workers on site. There are some restrictions, so please read the terms and conditions on the SafeWork New South Wales Small Business Rebate webpage first. All the resources that we've discussed today and more can be found when you search building and construction on the website at safework.nsw.gov.au, or you can scan the QR code. And we'll send these to you in an email after the webinar. Before I introduce our expert panel members who will be able to answer all your electrical questions today, I just wanted to remind you to type your questions into the Slido app on the screen. You'll be able to see other people's questions, and you can like their questions to help escalate them. Joining us online today is Bruce Blacker, Senior Coordinator for Electrical Inspections from New South Wales Fair Trading. Bruce joins us from his holidays as this is such an emerging issue that needs to be addressed. Thanks for attending, Bruce. And joining me on the lounge is Neil Roberts, State Inspector for Engineering for SafeWork, and Gary Colethorpe, Senior Inspector for Construction Stakeholder Engagement for SafeWork as well. Thanks for joining me today, and let's have a look at our first questions. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Thanks for attending.
Pleasure.
So we've got a few questions to start with. The first question is, does there have to be a licensed electrician on site at all times?
What is that? Yeah, whenever there is electrical wiring work occurring on site.
Yep.
Yes.
Cool.
Is the answer to that. Obviously, if they're doing other work not related to the installation, ultimately the licensed electrician has to observe that the work has been done correctly and supervise any inexperienced workers.
Cool. Thanks for that. Next one is, what are the requirements for working in close proximity to overhead and underground power lines? Gary, I know we were talking about this earlier.
We were, and you touched on it briefly in your presentation, but basically the things to keep in mind there are Clause 166 of the Work Health Safety Regulation says that you've got to make sure that people, plant or things are not able to get into close proximity to overhead power lines or underground services. So we need to keep that in mind. And it also says that you need to do a risk assessment and you need to take into account the asset owner's requirements, so the supply authority's requirements. And it also says, as we touched on earlier in Clause 291, that because you are any work that's on or near energised electrical installations or systems, you need to consider as high-risk construction work. So once you're talking about high-risk construction work, now we're talking about the need to do a safe work method statement. So those two things sort of complement one another. A safe work method statement is a risk assessment, really. So you need to make sure you go through and identify the hazards, you identify the risks for those hazards, and then determine the control measures, and you implement those controls. And you also have feedback from the asset owners as well on their requirements. So make sure you include those as well. Should also keep in mind that safety observers, the use of a safety observer is important here. Make sure they're a trained safety observer, so they've been trained by the network operator or they've been trained by an RTO. So you can't really just use anybody on site to observe when you're in close proximity to overhead or underground cabling. It needs to be a trained person. So keep that in mind. And that interaction with the asset owner is really important, because when inspectors come to site, if you have any work being undertaken in close proximity to overhead or underground services, we'll really want to see that interaction. We'll be looking for the correspondence between you and the supply authority, and to see that you've received their requirements and you've acted upon that as well. And also keep in mind there's a code of practice for overhead power lines, and in there you'll see really good detail in the tables for the proximity you need to keep from power lines, and it'll cover off trained and untrained workers. So it'll give you that detail. It'll also talk about the proximity of mobile plant. So it'll give you that guideline as well. And there's also an asset guide for underground cabling that you need to keep in mind as well. So there's some really good guidance material available to answer that question as well.
Yep. The other one there is the Look Up and Live app for the overhead power lines.
Absolutely. Yep.
And the Dial Before You Dig Australia,
yep.
Formerly Dial Before You Dig.
Absolutely.
Before You Dig Australia, to get the plans when you're excavating as well.
Spot on. Yep.
Thanks, Gary. Next one is, as a non-electrical worker, I need to enter a roof cavity and turn off the grid at the main and solar main to run cable telco. Do I need to turn off the isolator and battery? Ooh, that's a good question.
Isolator and battery.
And battery.
Well, it depends on the setup, really.
Yep.
Don't you think, Bruce?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that, Neil. But yeah, basically, look, when entering a confined space like a roof space, the ideal would be to isolate all supply. That way, you know that there's going to be nothing there at all. So, it would be best to isolate it at the batteries, at the solar, at the incoming supply. Some of that may be difficult because also needs isolation from the street mains if it's overhead supplied. But to be safe, that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, but you're quite right. Going into a roof space or underfloor, are particularly dangerous areas. Basically, if you get an electric shock there, you're exposed quite often to the full full belt. So you isolate certainly at the main switch, and you should be trying to isolate at the solar panels and the battery. But those instructions should be available somewhere on site.
Yeah.
And SafeWork have produced a really good video on that specific issue as well.
Okay.
So that's available through the website also. So yeah,
Nice.
I'd have a look at that for reference too. Yep.
Cool. Next question. What do you recommend for safety gear for electrical apprentices? I'd like to provide more safety equipment or uniforms to help my apprentice open his eyes on safety.
Okay. I'd start with looking at the most appropriate ARC-rated gear, and I'll refer you to Australian Standard 4836, Chapter 9, which talks specifically about the type of protective gear that you should have for different activities as well. So it'll go into testing, it'll go into operational fuses and that type of thing. But generally for electrical workers, it should be full length. Obviously, if everything's de-energised, it's less of an issue. But even at the point where you're testing, then you should have some basic ARC-rated wear, eye protection, obviously, and gloves, suitable gloves.
Yep. There's some really good face shields available now as well.
Yep.
They're inexpensive, they're lightweight, readily available. So we should look at as much protection as we can offer when you get down to PPE.
Yep. No worries. Next question is, what are the New South Wales requirements for electrical apprentices doing work like roughing in, etc., on non-energised cabling and the apprentice to electrician ratio? Bruce, do you want to?
I'll have a go at this one if you like. Yeah, basically, look, it's still electrical work. So the requirements of the regulations are pretty simple in that if any electrical work's been carried out, a licensed electrician must be on site to supervise. So it doesn't matter about where it's non-energised or roughing in or anything. There still must be a licensed electrician on site to supervise that apprentice or anybody else who's unlicensed carrying out that work. As far as the ratios go, well, at the end of it, you need to be able to safely supervise and ensure that the people are carrying out the work safely and that it complies. There has been a document put together in draft form that will hopefully explain this a bit further, but that will be probably another 12 months before it comes out into final circulation. But really at the moment, unfortunately, there's no set requirements in legislation, but all we can sort of say is, you can only supervise to ensure so many people. Like one person can't supervise 10, 15 people. It's an impossibility and ensure that they're all working safely and correctly.
There is some very good guidance available from associations like NECA that talk about direct, general and broad supervision without undermining that requirement for a licensed electrician to be on site when. So that takes you through the transition from brand new apprentice to fourth year who may be able to, you may be able to leave in a room to work by themselves for a little while, but it doesn't undermine that requirement for the licensed supervisor to be there.
Cool. Yep. Thanks for that. Next we got, is live testing allowed in a workshop environment when repairing and testing electrical equipment when using rubber gloves and PPE?
Clause 157, which is describes when energised electrical work is allowed, indicates that you can do testing for the purpose of proving de-energised, or you can do some live energised electrical work if there's no other way of actually completing the work properly. So it may fall into that category. The additional requirements you've listed there about rubber gloves and PPE, That's all contained in clause 161, and then we start looking at the way that's complied in the Australian Standard 4836. So, I guess the answer to that one is it depends.
Yep.
Can you justify doing it live under clause 157? If so, then the outcome there, though, is still that you need a licence to do it. Because by definition, to do any energised electrical work under the WHS legislation, you need to be a competent person, which is defined further as being a licensed electrician.
And that's the issue, isn't it? If you did a risk assessment on that activity, you get to the point where you're not de-energising, you've got a whole lot of considerations there. You really need to do a lot to make sure that situation is safe.
Yep.
If you're trying to make any decision not to de-energise. The default, the way of eliminating the risk is to de-energise.
Yep.
So if you're not eliminating it, now you're looking at that hierarchy of controls of how to engineer solutions or substitute something, separate or insulate. So, there's a whole lot of considerations you need to make. It's not an easy decision to make there to leave something energised in that situation.
And as I explained in the presentation, the first default, like you said, is is to de-energise.
Correct. Yep.
So, Daryl sent us in a question. I've heard that there is a new code of practice for work near overhead power lines coming soon. Any idea when this may be?
There is a consultation process internally going on at the moment. So I expect to see something come out for public consultation next year.
Cool. What are the most commonly overlooked electrical hazards that have the highest conversion rate to incidents and injury?
I think you touched on a bit of that too in your presentation, but I think when we've discussed this as well, we agreed that making contact with overhead or underground services is certainly a very high issue for construction sites, as well as that working with live, not de-energising. I think all those incidents we saw that you presented today, were all not de-energised. So that's clearly one of those things. But it all comes down to risk assessment. When we visit sites, construction sites, we're seeing a list. If you have a look at that checklist, that'll explain as well to you the sorts of things we see. We see those issues where there's non-consultation with the network on their working in close proximity. We see mobile plant working under live overheads or even trucks passing under without any sort of bunting or marking or tiger tails or anything like that. So we see those issues. We also see issues with electrical leads not test tagged and RCDs not tested, not using a construction type switchboard. I think one of the main things I've noticed is that electricians that are working on a construction site really need to be aware of the requirements for AS3012. And quite often they don't even know that exists. So if you're an electrician doing work on a construction site, please get access to NZ 3012 and learn the requirements for a construction site because they're quite different. You need to know AS 3000, but you also need to know the additional requirements from 3012. So
I'll actually highlight one more hazard which comes up pretty frequently. Use of reciprocating saws around underground cables, cutting through conduits.
Yep.
Can't tell you how many incidents we've had around that, but they come up pretty regularly.
Yep.
And obviously anyone who's doing that is directly exposed to something which could cause them quite a bit of harm.
Yeah, fortunately we see it all too often.
Yep.
As a construction principal contractor, do we have to obtain and keep record of CCEW once electrical work is finished? Bruce?
Yep. Look, as the principal contractor, in legislation, there's no requirement for it. There is a requirement for the person who issues the CCEW to keep it for 5 years. But of course, it's really the guarantee that the work has been done correctly and safely. So really, as for your own records, it would be a good idea to keep all those so that you have got a record if something goes down the track something goes wrong down the track, that it should have been done correctly and who has actually signed off that particular work, especially on a construction site where you have probably different people signing off different parts of the work. So, there's no requirement under legislation, but it'd be a very good idea to keep it.
Nice. Next question is test tagging on construction sites a legal requirement, and what penalties for non-compliance?
So pretty easy.
It certainly is a legal requirement. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, please.
That legal requirement is encompassed in clause 163 simply by complying with that standard which Gary was talking about. Compliance with that standard is a legal requirement, and within that standard, it specifies that plug-in equipment must be tested and tagged.
Yep.
And tested and tagged at least as frequently as the tables within that standard specify.
Yep.
And then RCDs as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's really those two standards. So AS 3760 we mentioned, and AS 3012. So in both of those standards, you'll see reference to sort of how in 3760 how to do the testing, what testing is required, and there'll be some guidance on frequency. Certainly 3012 will confirm the frequency on a construction site for test tagging for equipment and RCDs. Yep.
And I think we mentioned previously about that we're seeing more, it becoming more frequently than what is required, where a lot of sites are making it monthly, just blanket across to make sure it's all compliant across.
Correct. They're going above the requirements. Yep.
Cool. What are the requirements for locks on RCD boards?
Okay, this is a technical item in the in 3012. It requires that it be lockable, and that's the only requirement. There's nothing else in our legislation which says you must have it locked. In Victoria, I believe they do have that requirement, but we haven't added anything to our legislation to make it an absolute requirement. So the only thing we can enforce effectively is the requirement that has a facility to lock.
Okay. Is there any progress with ASPs being permitted to install visual indicators or tiger tails on overhead mains? Still significant lead times with network providers. Who'd like to take that one?
You're over that one, aren't you?
Tiger tails on mains certainly won't be the domain of an ASP2. The one where we have sort of the more problem is those smaller construction sites where they do have a problem with lead times. Getting the networks out to put up insulating material around the points of attachment. I guess all I can say here is that we have had discussions with the networks and so have some of our co-regulators about improving performance around that area. And I think there will be some relief in the future. I just can't tell you, when exactly that'll be.
Okay, thanks for that. What are the testing requirements for RCDs and temporary distribution boards?
Yeah, again, it comes back to those two standards. So it's stated in 3760 and backed up by 3012. So you really need to refer back to those standards. So, we can certainly give you some detail here today, but it may be out of date tomorrow. So the real recommendation is go to the current standards. They're all available through Standards Australia, and there's also some really good guidance material. So, always look at our website. Look at the Safe Work New South Wales website. Just type in your search into the search bar. There's a whole lot of good guidance material there, codes of practice that'll all guide you in this area. But also be prepared to update your copies of your Australian standards to stay on top of that.
There's also a page on our website that takes you through AS 3012. And attempts to condense that down into your main points.
That's right.
Cool. What guidance can you give? Read the definition of the term near in WHS Regs clause 291K is, quote, is carried out on or near energised electrical installations or services. Gary, I think you touched on that one earlier when you were talking about the guidance material.
That's right. And if you have a good look at that code of practice that's available online, it's got tabulated information. It's even got diagrammatically. It'll show you exactly where the no-go zones are and the encroachment boundaries, if you like. And that'll be a really good guide.
Yep.
And you had some other info too, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, but the basic information there is if you're coming within 3 metres of electrical service, an overhead service, then you're working near.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if you're working near without additional training, then you're actually breaching our legislation.
Yeah, correct.
For scaffolds, it's 4 metres.
4 metres.
So any scaffold work or an established scaffold without hoarding, if you're within 4 metres, then you're in breach of that clause.
Yep.
So, and then for underground, you're pretty much guided by the information you get from before you dig Australia.
Yep. Cool. Comment here is I agree temp board circuit breakers do not need to be locked, but understand consultation is needed on a procedure for resetting circuits.
Yeah, no doubt. That's part of the risk assessment process and consultation requirements.
Yep.
Straightforward. If you have a trained safety observer lifting near overhead power lines, does the crane operator need to be a trained safety observer as well?
Well, it's not trained safety observer. It's what they call an accredited person.
Yep.
In the code of practice for working near overhead power lines, and I can't remember the exact name of the course, but it's working near electrical apparatus for non-electrical workers. I think something very close to that.
That information is available on our website too, under the building construction page.
Yep.
So on that page, you'll see building and construction, and there's a whole heap of drop-down arrows. If you click on the electrical, and you'll find the information under that one as well. So just have a look under there, and it'll detail all the information on that you need as well.
Yeah. But to answer the question, a operator of a mobile plant and their safety observer have to be accredited persons.
Yep.
So they both need it.
Cool. Interested to hear some of the issues fair trading are seeing out there. Bruce?
Okay, yeah, look, we're seeing lots of different issues. One of the ones is actually something that was mentioned before, is about non-supervised work. We've actually come across just recently over the last a couple of weeks of going onto site during our inspections and finding apprentices working unsupervised with no tradesmen on site. For those, we sort of feel a little bit sorry for the apprentices. We only give them a warning, but we don't feel sorry for the company or the nominated supervisor. They get fined. Basically, pretty simple. So that's probably one of the major issues on that side of it is, unsupervised work for apprentices. It is a pretty big issue for the industry. The other side of it is just ensuring that your work meets compliance standards. One of the main issues we find when we're carrying out audit inspections is, I suppose, separation from electrical to other services, water pipes, gas pipes, refrigeration, and also people working beyond their licenses. Okay, especially air conditioning people who want to do electrical work. There's a very strict requirements on what they are and aren't allowed to do, the same as for electricians to carry out air conditioning work and associated trades. So they're probably the major things we're seeing out on site.
Cool. Thanks for that, Bruce. We've got a question. Do Safe Work and Fair Trading do joint inspections at the same time?
The answer is sometimes. There has been quite a bit of activity around that lately, hasn't there, Bruce?
There has been. It depends on the projects. We there's a number of different projects going on at different times for compliances and compliance checkings. Some of those will be fair trading work with SafeWork, where we'll go out with SafeWork inspectors. They'll do the safety side of it. We'll do the electrical side. But we're also doing it with other teams who are going out and checking building works or for just licensing checks or other requirements. So it depends on the projects that are being sort of introduced at different people, time by different people. But yeah, there's a lot more of it happening than ever used to happen, where we are all combining resources to actually get out and try and make sure things are being done correctly and being done safely, and that not only electrical trades but all trades and that are meeting compliance requirements.
Yep. And I do know we do often speak to each other as well about what's coming up and what things have been seen as well, so that we can pass things on to each other that if there are concerns out there as well. So cool. Look, if you've got any other questions, please send them through. We're answering as many as we can get to today. We've just got one. You spoke about new penalties before. How will these be enforced by inspectors? I think I'll sort of expand on that a little bit. The information that we've provided, the resources we'll speak to about the checklist that we've developed that's on our website. That details what we are looking for when we're out on site. We're not trying to hide anything from anyone. So you can actually see what we are looking for, and it's all related back to the legislation as well. So if you're ticking off all those boxes in that checklist, then you're going to be covered with everything, and you should be covered with everything anyway. When it comes to enforcing it, we are taking a zero tolerance approach to putting workers' safety at risk, and we'll take the appropriate action based on what's happening at each site. And we do need to talk to the people involved on site to make sure that we get the right results as well. Do you guys have anything to sort of add?
Oh, look, the new penalties have been introduced because we've seen quite a lot of non-compliance with specific activities. So the classic one is metal scaffold. Lots of development going on, particularly around high-rise buildings where the scaffold is just way too close to the overhead mains.
Yep.
So scaffolders should take note, because you're all told that 4 metres is the limit. Principal contractors should also be aware of this and put it into their safety management plan for the site.
Yep.
So we're unlikely to give too much leeway to when we observe that, especially some of the ridiculous ones we see, which come within a metre of overhead mains. Likewise, some sites, the feedback I get from our inspectors is that they go and see electrical equipment really not installed safely at all.
Yeah, exactly.
So at that point, it's the principal contractor really needs to be aware and observing that their installation is safe.
Yep.
So
and if it's not safe, they need to turn it off.
Yeah, and like when they need to do when you're doing a risk assessment, it needs to be specific to that site and that situation. So it may involve de-energising. So if you're trying to erect a scaffold in close proximity to an overhead, you may need to work with the asset owner to have that section of overhead de-energised.
In fact, you're required to.
Yeah, while you're erecting and dismantling that scaffold.
Yep.
But then once it's up, you may be in a different situation where the asset owner may tell you to put up construction ply or barriers to separate the two. So you've got to do that risk assessment. You've got to negotiate with the asset owners and assess each one on its merits, really.
Yep. Are the PPE requirements the same for testing at a live switchboard as they are for testing at a PowerPoint?
Depends on the switchboard. If there's large elements of exposed conductor and bus bars, the PPE will, and it depends on the fault level too, doesn't it, Bruce?
Yep, that's definitely.
So there is actually guidance on arc flash hazards, and if the fault level is significant enough, you should be escalating the PPE as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
And again, you should always reconsider the need, like that one of those incidents we saw the images of, where there was exposed bus bar. You really need to reconsider if that activity has to take place with that board live. Again, coming back to the de-energise situation, had there been an option to de-energise that board, which in hindsight there may have been, then that incident wouldn't have occurred. So that's also a way to think of your risk assessment. Look at the worst case scenario and work back from that. What can I do to stop this incident happening? What's the worst thing that could happen, and how do we work back from that? So certainly testing at a power point, where there's no live copper, is going to be completely different to taking covers off a switchboard and exposing bus bar and copper. So, yeah, they certainly need to be assessed completely differently.
Yep, and later on, or shortly, early next year, hopefully, the new ANZS 4836 will be out, which will have a lot more information on this when it does come out. It really covers off a lot more information on arc flash and all the additional requirements depending on where you're working.
Yep. The next one was technical one. I think this one's for you, Neil.
So,
if I were to test a 10 amp final sub-circuit at a power point to confirm live, would I be required to wear a minimum ATPV 4 cal per centimetre squared?
54. That's I'm not familiar with my clothing rating, but 10 KA, required to wear a minimum. I'd refer to the guidance in 4836.
Okay.
There's still a risk of a flash, albeit fairly small.
Yeah.
So I think the guidance would still be you wear your protective gear like an electrician should, including suitable gloves. But
Yep.
And eye protection, obviously.
Yeah.
Flashes are quite bad for the eyes.
Okay. Is it possible for SafeWork to send out information to all electricians regarding the unsupervised apprentice issue? We have information on our website available. We are, as part of this, to the attendees today, we are sending out the information around unsupervised workers and young vulnerable workers as well. So you can find that information there. As for sending it out to every electrician, I don't know that it may be possible.
It is possible. We've done it fairly recently for another issue.
Yep.
And
it's something that we can look into.
But I think we're waiting for the guidance to effectively settle, aren't we, Bruce, before we actually do that?
We are. Like, I really think that generally the electrical industry knows what it is, what the requirements are. It's been a case of for many years they just wanted to turn a blind eye to make things easier for themselves. So yes, the material's always been out there for a long time, I think, generally to the electrical industry. And as Neil said, there's numerous ways we can do. SafeWork, you have your newsletters. Fair Trading will start producing newsletters to the electrical industry shortly as well. So if we consider it necessary, we may add that to them. But yeah, as I said, I really think probably that most of the electrical industry knows what the requirements are. They just don't want to know what the requirements are because it's easier not to obey than what it is, to actually follow those requirements.
I'm cognizant of the time. We've just got a couple more questions to go. Do SafeWork and Fair Trading work together with distributors? Start with you, Bruce. Fair Trading?
Look, we do. The issue that we get is that actually Fair Trading's responsibility starts where the distributors finish. So yeah, we'll talk to distributors about some of the issues that they have and some of the requirements and that. And of course, we do speak to them, when it comes to things like the service rules and metering rules, etc. But yeah, the Fair Trading, our regulations really start where the supply authority's requirements finish.
And Neil, I know.
Yeah, I'm in pretty regular contact with the networks. And Bruce and I both sit on the industry safety steering committee, where various issues are brought up from time to time, and that's a broad representation in that committee. It's got all of the regulators and the unions are invited as well. So, coming from that, that's where you get some industry guides and subcommittees which actually produce some of those guides. So yes, we're constantly in communication, and yes, I'm working on a few projects with the distributors now to hopefully improve both communication and compliance out on the networks.
Cool. Are there any registered institutions that could assist a company to comply and follow the regulations? In other words, SWIMS assistance?
Well, there's a couple of ones for electricians. So NECA and Master Electricians spring to mind.
Would be the first point.
Their members get access to libraries of that sort of stuff. And they, you can pick out the library and contextualise it to the work that you actually do.
Yeah. Master Builders also for some of the PCs and things like that as well. So yes, there are plenty out there.
True.
Can unlicensed electricians run cable in decks and slabs without supervision from licensed electrician, not exposing them to any live cables?
Well, what's an unlicensed electrician? The default answer to this one is no, because because at the point where you energise it, a licensed electrician needs to sign off that it actually all complies with AS3000.
Yeah.
And running wires under decks or in slabs, there's a whole section of that in AS3000 which needs to be complied with.
Yep.
But that's still, I'm sorry to steal your thunder.
No, that's all good.
Still, it's electrical work, isn't it, Bruce?
It is. It's still electrical work. Really, there's only two types of people. There's either a licensed electrician or somebody who's unlicensed. It doesn't matter whatever qualification that they've got. And it's pretty simple. If it's electrical work, anything, installing cables, installing cable tray, anything to do with electrical work, it's got to be supervised by a licensed electrician and they need to be on site. I don't think we can make it any simpler.
No, agree. Thanks very much for that, guys. Thanks for attending. That's all the questions that we've got for today. If you've got any other questions that you want to ask us and you haven't had a chance to type them in, you can send them through to interventions@safework.nsw.gov.au. We'll get those and be able to reply to you. As I also mentioned, after this, we're going to be sending out some information with the resources that we've spoken about today and with a short survey. If you could go through and fill that in, that'd be great. And you can also reply to that email with any questions that you have. Thanks very much for attending today, guys. Appreciate it. And thanks for your expertise. Thanks, Bruce. And yeah, stay safe. Thank you.